Okay, we're back, and let's continue with our conversation about how we are socialized to understand what is expected of a person who is the sex that we are. So, teachers are very important in conveying messages about appropriate behavior for a boy or for a girl. Here's another Norman Rockwell picture with a nice schoolmarm standing in front of her class of diligent students. Teachers are so influential from the very beginning. Their behavior is oftentimes internalized by members of the class as behaviors that those students might want to emulate themselves, or behaviors that they would want to avoid themselves. But more importantly than how they act and just like how they are, I wanted to talk about some of the things that they do in the classroom that give messages about what it means to be male or what it means to be female. Like, for example, research has shown that elementary school teachers tend to call on little boys more often than they call on little girls. They also tend to let little boys shout out answers without raising their hands more often than they let little girls do that. And so when the very teachers who were in the study were confronted with this evidence that look how often you called on boys, or look how often you let the boys shout out, they gave excuses that were very stereotypical. They would say things like, well, if I don't let them answer, then they interrupt anyway. Very stereotyping that this is how boys are. So I have to act like this because that's how boys are. And so on the one hand, they're stereotyping boys and they're sort of encouraging assertive behavior, maybe even disruptive behavior by kind of rewarding it, right? By calling on the boys who have their hands up or who are interrupting. And they're also simultaneously giving messages to girls that behaving in the way that I've asked you to, which is, put your hand up if you want to answer the question, is not necessarily the way to do it. But even if you do put your hand up, I'm going to call on a boy anyway. Right? Like the boys need to be heard first. And so teachers are giving sort of like this dual-edged message through their tendency to treat the boys in the classroom differently than the girls in the classroom. Now, what was really interesting was I saw a news report, and it's so old, I can't find it on the internet anywhere, but it was one of those 2020 pieces from back in the 90s. And so they talked to the teachers who had been part of the research, and the teachers were saying how shocking it was to them that they had no idea that they were behaving differently. They weren't doing it on purpose. And so a lawyer who teaches at a law school said, I saw this piece. And so they did a follow-up piece on it. And he says, I saw this piece that you did. And I thought, well, that might be what they do in the, elementary school years, but I definitely don't do it in law school. And he was explaining how, half of his students are male and half of his students are female. And that the way that law school is set up is, the Socratic method where, the teacher has this, seating chart where he has everybody's names written down, and the teacher makes sure to call out every student at some point and put them on the spot because everybody's supposed to come to school prepared and ready to talk. And he actually makes marks on his seating chart while he's doing it so that he knows who he's called on and stuff. But then he thought, well, but that's me calling on them. Maybe I need to follow up on this on whether I'm answering more male questions than I am female questions. Right? So me asking the students questions, I know that I'm being even-handed, but am I being even-handed on taking questions? So he decided that when, he has that seating chart. So whenever he took a question from a male, he put a tick mark in the male column, and then he refused to take another question from a male until he had taken a question from a female. So he was as deliberately as possible, exactly making sure that half the questions were male and half the questions were female. And he was not allowing people to shout out, without their hand up and other kinds of things. You can only speak when I call on you. Law school is very dictatorial. And so at the end of the quarter or semester, he was like, it felt exactly the same to me. I don't think anything was different about this class. And he was completely confident that he had behaved like his normal self until he got his course evaluations, where the female students were saying, wow, this is the greatest professor ever. He really listens to us, really pays attention, things like that. And the male students were saying that they didn't like how the professor let the women run the class and stuff. And he's like, wow, this must have been a very, a deviation from normal behavior in our classes here in law school, because the students were not expecting this kind of behavior. Even the women were surprised to see this kind of behavior. And so even at the advanced levels, it's possible that teachers respond differently to males and to females and encourage different kinds of behaviors out of males and females. But really, probably the socialization component, the most important phase, we have documented evidence that in the elementary years, teachers do treat males and females differently. So this little boy is saying, is there some place I can sign up for the do not call on me list, right? Like, maybe I don't always want to have to know the answers, whatever. All right. My final category of entities that socialize us would be the media. And I picked a nice Rosie the Riveter picture to show, here's a socialization that the media deliberately did to try and encourage women. You can do it. You can work in a factory. Of course, once the women started working in the factory, they were like, hey, this is pretty cool. I've got money. I feel like I'm really contributing and this is really empowering. And then the men came home and they were told, go back home. So apparently we can do it, but stop doing it when we don't need you anymore. But the media is usually a little more subtle than the trying to deliberately give women, a boost talk like this one is. The media is much more insidious. And when I say media, I really want to make sure that you guys who are listening realize that like what you're listening to right now is technically media, right? It's a message that's being conveyed to you that's been pre-planned. You can tell from my PowerPoints that I planned this out and I'm trying to convey information to you. So I want you to think about the podcasts that you listen to. I want you to think about the YouTube videos that you watch. So a lot of younger students, younger to me, will say to me, well, I don't consume very much media. I just watch things on the internet. And that's called media. So if you are consuming something that somebody else has produced, you're consuming media. If you read a magazine or a blog post or a book or watch a movie, those are all media. And they're all including messages about what it means to be male or female, or to be transgender, or to be, any kind of queer or any kind of group could be being depicted by the media. And the most common problem with the media is they oftentimes simplify the characters so that you get sort of this very stereotypical view about what it means to be the gender of the character. So it's, and then the other thing that is really insidious is when we have a single case, like for example, I've shown you 2 cases in this week's lectures. Those cases don't necessarily represent every single person with those conditions, do they? They are just an example. And that's the thing about media depictions, is that a lot of times it's an example, but because we don't know very many people who belong to that group, we may think that they are more representative of the group than they really are. So media can be just really super subtle in the way that it sort of just gets into our understanding and our what we'll call schemas. And it helps to build a framework for how we're understanding what it means to be one sex or the other in the context of this social situation. And it causes us to simplify and then stereotype. And so then we get messages that make us think we're supposed to be acting a certain way, or that people who belong to another group should be acting a different way, or things like that. And that's where socialization can be really harmful. This sort of internalization without us even knowing that we've internalized the message. So, and socialization isn't always bad. I mean, one of the functions of socialization is that we all sort of, get on the same page about, what's expected or whatever. But we belong to a society that really values individuality and being able to be our own selves and those kinds of things. And so socialization can be quite limiting. So I wanted to sort of wrap up with the continuums of gender identity and gender expression. I did look it up. It could be continuums or continua. So I went with continuums in case you think I've got bad grammar. Like, which way does this go? So we've got gender identity on one hand, and we've got gender expression on the other. So I've talked about gender identity being our sense of which gender we belong to. And then we have gender expression being the outward portrayal of the gender that we feel aligned with. So there are these continuums of along gender identity, masculine to feminine, and in the middle would be, there are a lot of different labels for what might be in the middle here, but androgynous is sort of in psychology the most common term for what's in the middle of masculine and feminine. So in androgyny, you have a person who feels like partly masculine traits describe them and partly feminine traits describe them. So they feel like a mix, a blend. Androgynous was coined to combine andro is androgens, gyne is, it really literally means uterus, so that's specific. So we're trying to combine that masculine and feminine together. And that's what you see is that the person has internalized both masculine and feminine traits. With gender expression, we've got, again, the continuum runs from masculine to feminine. And there, again, are lots of different words that could be in this middle. I put non-binary, I put genderqueer. These are two terms that are pretty common right now for describing a person who, in their expression, so their style of dress, the way that they wear their hair, the, all those little nuanced things that sort of gestures and body postures and little nuanced things that sort of are unconscious, that we just put out there. Though that would be what we mean by gender expression. It also could include behaviors, so liking to do this or that. The liking part would be under gender identity, and then doing this or that would be under gender expression. So we end up with 4 basic types, and this I say with a big question mark, because I think that there's a wider continuum, but so if we are masculine in our identity and masculine in our expression, then we are in fact male, which is what that male sign means there. That means we are gender conforming. If we are masculine in our identity, but feminine in our expression, and it doesn't matter whether you're male or female to be in this category, you would be gender nonconforming. Same thing if you're over here with a masculine gender expression and a feminine gender identity. Again, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, you would be labeled gender nonconforming. And then if you're feminine in your identity and feminine in your expression, and you are in fact female, then you would be labeled gender conforming. So there are lots of different ways that people are grouping these issues having to do with gender and people's internalization. The key thing is probably to keep our minds more open than my little quadrants imply, because I think ultimately we're going to maybe end up with a third dimension of something that we haven't currently incorporated into our theories that account for gender, identity expression, and then maybe something else helps us to really distinguish that. But right now, this is sort of like the basic model. I also want to just kind of finish by mentioning that, this class is a human sexuality class. And so this is just like one little chapter in the midst of, 18 chapters in this textbook. And so, we have whole classes, and indeed we have whole departments devoted to this issue. And so I'm giving just a very bare bones kind of description of the basic issues, and we'll leave it to the experts in the other areas to really take you deeper into these issues. So if you feel unsatisfied with the way that I covered this, I apologize. But I am, I'm not teaching gender and sexuality. I'm teaching human sexuality. And so I'm sort of keeping it brief. But hopefully I've intrigued you and have left you with some questions. And then see, there's other people who can answer those questions for you. So hopefully this little picture helps to clarify sort of, differences between internalized sense of self and then expression that other people are picking up on. All right. And then stereotypes. All right. Let's stop here and come back for our final home run into the finish line where we talk about gender stereotyping.